Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Technically Not Speaking. My name is Chaitanya Bhati, and I am your co host. But alongside, I am also a product manager. I'm based here in the US and I work for Walmart. And this is my friend and co host.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Prachi. I'm a product marketing manager. I'm also based out of here. I'm in California. Chaitanya is in Seattle. And I've also been working in tech, still in tech, worked with a bunch of big companies and startups. And we are together, technically not speaking. And this is episode 3.
Yes. And for those of you who have been following us, you know that this is our third episode. So if you haven't had a chance yet to go and watch our first two episodes, please take this opportunity to do that. Just to do a bit of a recap, in our last episode, which was episode number 2, we spoke about the parallels between ancient civilizations and modern day technology. We specifically covered three civilizations, which is Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Chinese.
Yeah.
And in these civilizations, I won't go deeper into that, but just a very high level, we spoke about the hieroglyphs, we spoke about the Babylonian tablets, and Prachi also covered an amazing story about this Chinese inventor. So, yeah, if you haven't yet watched our episode 2, just go and give it a thought.
Yes, and today we are again continuing on our timelining approach. So, when we started the podcast, we told our listeners and our viewers that we're going to take them back into the history, do a sort of time stamping or a timelining to come to the future and what we see for generative AI and tech and AI tools. So, just continuing the same theme, today we are going to be talking about three other civilizations that comes later into picture to what Chaitanya said, like after the Mesopotamians and Chinese and Egyptians. So we have today we'll be covering the Mayans,
Mhm.
the Peruvians, and within Peru there were a couple of different civilizations. So there were the Nazcas and the Incas, and then we'll get into the Romans before we then step into 18th century.
Very exciting. So, Prachi, please do the honors.
Absolutely. So we'll start first with the Mayans. And I'm very fascinated by both of these. And I think we were talking about this also.
Yeah.
Both of these civilizations, so Peruvian and the Mayans, because I think they share a lot of commonalities in terms of their sophistication, the way they used astronomy, the way they used mathematics, and how they were combining spirituality to, I think, some extent to create powerful tools and do decision making. So I think long before we get into algorithms and we see neural networks, we talk about them now, we will cover Mayans. And Mayans were essentially in the Mexico, Guatemala area, today what we call these areas as, and some parts of, I believe, Central America. And I've been to a bunch of these Mayan ruins in Mexico and Guatemala.
Yeah.
Always fascinated with it. And they built, again, similar to even Romans, Peruvians, or any other civilization, they also built these massive cities. They map stars with, like I said, astronomy was a big part of it with accuracy. And they also developed a really advanced writing system. Every civilization is very unique.
I think that's a given, right?
Yeah.
Whatever civilizations we've covered so far in the first and second episode, there's so much that we have seen that actually started with writing and forming a language and then taking things ahead from there. Like, how do you communicate? First of all, how do you communicate without having a language? And for that language, you need to have your own ideals of how you want it to. What is the whole translation of things? I mean, excited to hear what you have to say about Mayans today because I know Mayans for the Mayans calendar, right? And then everything else that we read about this. But yeah,
Yeah, no, we also discussed a couple of things. So please chime in with your interesting facts.
of course.
I'll go into 751 CE, and there was a city, I think it was called, pronunciation, please don't go by it. It was Umal or and the city was in trouble, the crops were failing, illnesses were spreading, and king's advisors were sent out for ideas until they found the lady who was not just a priestess, but I think what we can call her in today's day and age is like a modern data scientist. So obviously they didn't have that concept before.
Yeah.
But she came forward and she said the kingdom is threatened, it's in crisis. There have been 3 consecutive seasons where the the yields weren't as good for the crops. There were
Mm.
mysterious illnesses, and I think 3 seasons is a lot, right, for any kingdom to diminish. And there were also tensions rising up with neighboring city. Whatever traditional solutions you have, like king's advisors and people at the time could come up with, they started somehow failing. And
Mm.
even the people were very divided because, okay, like nothing is working out. So then she was a priestess. She was also a mathematician. I don't know how much of it is documented, but
Mm.
she is. And I
Yeah.
think we both are making an effort to cover a lot of female narratives, which I think are also lost
Yeah.
back in the day. She was not doing it on the king's account or anything, but because she was such a curious person herself and a mathematician, she had spent a lot of years studying pattern recognition in natural systems. So, like weather cycles, disease outbreaks, we were also discussing it earlier that how she would literally send out her people and ask, or she'll go and take feedback and understand, okay, this time this is happening, or for this season continuously this happened, or how the trade patterns were going into it, and looking at other environmental factors. She created, and she also mapped the connection between weather, disease, and human behavior,
Wow.
which is,
Very interesting.
yeah.
So basically, she was, we can call this, right? Like reverse engineered reinforcement learning.
Yeah, yeah. I would say reinforcement learning. Like
Yeah.
we can easily map it out to that. What she did was she created something called as Echel's chamber. It
Hmm.
was this hidden palace, sorry, hidden place beneath the palace. And it was this room which was acoustically engineered. I don't know how they did it then, but it had stone walls that would amplify certain frequencies, muffle the others, and seem mystical to the outsiders. But this was essentially a tool of insight. So
Mm.
before any major decision, she and her assistants, they would gather the data, so the crop yields, rainfall patterns, trade updates, and all of these things,
Yeah.
and encoded it in like knotted chords. And I know we'll be covering that.
Very interesting. And when you started this whole conversation, you started with how Mayans and the Peruvian civilization are so similar. To our listeners who are
Yeah.
probably wondering what are we talking about, like once Prachi covers the Mayans and once I move to Peruvian, you'll understand the significance with respect to the Knot culture. But yeah, Prachi, I'll not steal your thunder. Please go
No,
ahead.
please. We are both here discussing our perspectives. And I
Yeah.
know knotted chords is that commonality.
Yeah.
So it in chords because you're studying different systems. And then they would take, we didn't speak about ayahuasca.
I was waiting for you to say that. I'm like, oh yeah, interesting topic coming up.
No, I don't know how appropriate it is to use other words, but they would take vision enhancing natural substances. And then they'd enter the chamber and speak aloud these possible solutions, and the chamber would respond not with voices but with sounds. So, echoes and resonances highlighted which ideas felt right and help them with the best path ahead. Yeah, I know it. It takes a turn.
But it's very interesting. So, two things over here. One is how there is a parallel between a brain computer interface. Oh, wow, there she is. Yeah, like a brain computer interface, basically Neuralink, right?
Yeah, yeah,
More of a non-invasive neurotech, if we may, which
yeah.
again, like they rely on feedback loops between our brains and machines. But in this, I feel like in this story, what you mentioned, she's used cognition and psychedelics.
Both, absolutely. Yeah. And I think listeners won't be able to, but viewers can see how these knots and worked in this chamber look like. And I think that's pretty fascinating.
Very fascinating. Yeah. And I think we're finally coming to a full circle on this whole idea that
Yeah.
altered states through psychedelics, right? It can actually enhance pattern recognition. You mentioned that she used acoustics, so some sort of music sort of a situation there.
Could be an acoustics again. We don't know if it's echoes or just like sounds coming out, but you're right. It reinforces the Actually, it mirrors the reinforcement learning system. And I think this image can show what kind of modern parallel we can draw to. Oracle's VP for AI, she also commented on this, and they said they are trying to build the platforms that echo the Mayan model. So
Wow.
think of mixing data analysis with human intuition. I think that's what everyone's trying to achieve at this point. And just how they had the Ishil's chamber, which guided Lady Sakuk. I think leaders are also thinking how they can combine the data and insight. And I think you mentioned Neuralink, but then there's obviously like you have Meta, you have IBM. Everyone's exploring these hybrid models, like
Yeah.
pattern recognition, human insight, just like how Mayans did it. So I think this is pretty interesting link
Yeah.
to the past.
I think it definitely is. And especially like ladies, like how she actually engineered an experience which helped people think better. And with not just a tool,
Absolutely.
it is a takeaway for people in product as well. If you see with comparison to modern tech, this is something product design today can think of or still learn from. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And I think now we'll move. Oh, my bad. Now we will move to the Peruvians, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
Yeah, I think with what you shared, the timeline you spoke about, you mentioned two separate civilizations, the Nazca civilization and the Inca civilization.
Yeah.
So the Nazcans and the Incans were two distinctive pre-Columbian cultures in Peru,
Yeah.
and they were actually separated over a millennium in time, like around 1,000 to 1,500 years. And
Mm.
there is no proof which says that got carried over from Nazca to Inca
Yeah.
as of now. So if I start with the Nazcans, right? So the Nazcan people, we have to actually before jumping into the story, I have to lay the ground, like what exactly were the Nazcans famous for?
Yeah.
The Nazcan people lived in one of the driest environments on the planet. It is believed that this place, at one point, like it never experienced a single drop of rainfall, and the rainfall was really very rare.
Mhm.
And yet somehow this civilization managed to thrive. Now, here's where everything gets interesting. They actually engineered their survival. They turned the desert into a responsive system, and they did it using what we can call as natural intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we discussed again, and I also read about them. I know you'll be getting into how they built out the infrastructure,
Yeah.
but I don't know. Do you think how do you it's just I have questions. Maybe I'll reserve them for later.
Okay, got it. So, I guess, like, for how they did it, right? Let me talk about the most famous thing that they left behind, which is the Nazcan lines. So, if I have to share some reference, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You must have seen this all over social media for the ones who are not aware also. They must have just seen these images floating or maybe somewhere in your history books. So the Nazcan lines are actually these geoglyphs they look very small in these pictures, but they actually span hundreds of feet. If you ever see an aerial photo of a giant hummingbird, say a monkey, or even a massive, like a spiral that is etched in the core of the earth, that's them. And they actually created these geoglyphs. So there's this, and you know what is truly mind blowing is when you remember that they were made without drones, planes, or any way to view these designs from the sky.
With I think that's what my question was. It's so difficult to design something that
Yeah.
can be seen from sky and it's accurate when you cannot see it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think what you mentioned for Nazcan lines, and maybe this is more of a question because I think we've seen it in some way or the other, or if not, it's I think very interesting for people to go and read up. Is it more like spatial data encoding, or do we talk about building that smart infrastructure where you combine earth, intuition, read the land, respond? There's nothing. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, and there are like, so just like how you're asking these questions, right? Like till date, people are still asking questions, and for years there were like multiple theories that were there, and the most bizarre theories were alien communication. Humans are always fascinated by aliens, so we're like, oh, maybe they were trying to communicate with aliens, but turns out that, like, I think the most recent research is all edging towards these being as ritual pathways. And the more recent studies, they also say that some of these lines might have had like very practical functions, basically making underground water sources,
Yeah.
mapping out ceremonial walkways, or like how you mentioned, like even acting as a geocoded calendar.
Yeah. Agreed. And do we know how many animals or plant figures were depicted? Because I believe, or maybe there's some data around it, I don't know exactly, but was it what? How many kilometers of Nazcan lines?
It's spread across miles, and you can like still see them from when you take like aerial views. And I read some paper where it was mentioned that the most recent study, they discovered 300 more. So like most recent, they have discovered 300 more. So there have been like
Oh,
tons which must have been covered by dust storms and everything, but there are like tons out there.
oh, okay. I didn't know that it's like more. I thought maybe like 50, 70,
No.
60. But
Yeah, there are a lot of them. And if you have to think of it from a very modern tech perspective, right? If we have to like let our viewers like get a perspective, what do you think this is? It could actually, if you look at the parallel, right? This seems the Earth, they're turning Earth into a data map. Like basically information is in physical space, and what we have today is geotagging, right? We have augmented reality overlays, we have a satellite based land diagnosis, we have geofencing. But the Nazcans were doing something similar, but just more grounded and more literally drawing those lines and then giving those carvings out on the ground.
yeah, just like geocoding or creating the map for future or building it out for future generations for that matter.
Yeah.
And how would they take it ahead?
Yeah. So,
And you're right, GPS mimics this interface really well.
yeah, so just very easy comparison here. Like on the left side, we are seeing the Nazcan lines, right? Again, vast geoglyphs. And then on the right side, what we are seeing is like a more modern landscape with which has a location pin and it has GPS geotagging. So it's very similar to that. And it's very interesting how, like so many thousands of years ago, they actually thought of these things. And what we are actually doing right now is just mimicking ancient technology.
I personally feel while doing all these episodes and us talking and researching, I'm beyond fascinated how every single civilization or culture or even a particular city, they
Yeah.
had their own, to your point, writing, symbols, math, science, engineering.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Everything was done for humans to be able to a communicate and to take care of the basic necessities. To actually, I wouldn't even say basic necessities, like we don't know how and what these were used for, but
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating. Yep.
What's interesting, they didn't stop there. The Nazcans didn't stop there.
Yeah.
Like, so beneath these desert flows, right,
Um,
they actually created something even more impressive. That is the Pukios.
yes.
If I have to give a reference,
Yeah.
basically these spiral shaped underground aqueducts, which aqueducts, sorry, these were not just ditches, right? They were actually engineered systems for water extraction. They used gravity, airflow, earth pressure to keep like groundwater circulating and make it more accessible. Like how I mentioned at the beginning that this was a land which was spanned across like deserts and no rain at all for like several, I don't know, for several like miles away. And then they actually built this.
I think it was also ceremonial. That's my guess. You know how a lot of calendars, and you spoke about the Mayan calendar. So with solstice, right? Beginning of spring, end of spring, beginning of fall. I think they also maybe created these aqueducts, that what you call them. I think so, suggesting astronomical hydrological functions, but maybe too. It's just a guess.
No, one would think that, but if you think from a practical point of view, and that is what researchers have been working on for a very long time, and because it is one of the driest environments possible, instead of building surface level canals and that where water can just evaporate, it made more sense for them to build these underground. And just understand this, that there were no pumps, there were no wires, there was no code like how we have in our like smart irrigation system these days. But it still feels like a very modern day smart irrigation system.
Yeah, absolutely. Or we can call them analog algorithms.
Yep,
I think
yep,
so. Yeah, I need to go to Peru, but a bunch of my friends have been to Peru. Did tell some of these are still functional. These
yep.
ducks. I think so. They are functional. I'm not 100%
Oh,
sure.
they are. They are. I did watch a video of someone explaining how even today, like there's water flowing, and there are like these narrow pathways, which are these ducts, and there are these small villages that they actually extract water from there.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
still using it. So it must be extremely functional and built for durability. Very well engineered.
Yeah, and what we have today, like if I have to show a comparison, right? If you look at Pukios in this image here, and then you look on the right side, this is a smart irrigation system. So, feature wise, when you just look at how it was designed, the Pukios were designed in spiral shaped and sorry, spiral shaped shafts, which was actually going deep under, so the water would stay inside and it would not evaporate quickly, like just having an open source. And similarly, in smart infrastructure, like you have these IoT devices which are self regulating, there's low energy, they're sensor driven. And even like on the Pukio side, if you look, they're gravity fed canals, right? And for our AI system over here, it's just as learn from the results, change, adjust according to the behavioral patterns.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting how all of these features are so similar. It's just that one has been like completely man-made, or we don't know if they use any technology. We don't know that yet. But in today's world, like we just like mimicking exactly whatever feature sets and the use cases that were back then, and using it in our smart irrigation system.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
We call it smart when a building adjusts lighting based on sunlight, or when a garden waters itself using AI. But the NASA actually did the same thing with stone, gravity, and airflow, and we
Pretty.
call ourselves smart.
I think I was not too curious about these two. I think Incans are my favorite because they have parallels to mines. So, are we
Yeah,
segueing into the Incans?
yeah, you're very biased, so I'm just gonna jump into
I
the.
am. I'm like, please get to the fun part of the story.
Okay, so we spoke about desserts and then we spoke about Nazcans, and I guess it's now time that we got into the Incan civilization. As maybe Incans are more famous because they were later in the
Absolutely.
civilization. Like if you see maybe 13th to 15th century, so they flourished in the highlands of South America, and they ruled over 10 million people, which if you compare in today's modern day, that's quite a lot for that time.
It was a big empire, actually.
It was a very big empire, yes.
2,500 miles. 20 must be. To
Yep,
do over 10 million. Yeah.
yeah. And I think the most fascinating part is they managed this massive mountainous empire without a written language, without the wheel, and without iron tools.
Yeah.
And I'll show you how they did that. It's through this.
Yes.
It's literally this. So, this, what we're looking at, is called as a kipu. Kipu. I just want to be sure I'm pronouncing it right, but there are like a couple of ways.
It is Kipu.
So these were, as you can see, like these were bundles of colored knotted strings that were used by the Incas to record information systems. When you look at them, it first looks like maybe jewelry or some decorative tassel, but in every sense of the word, these were actually data systems.
Yes.
Each knot represented a number, and the position on the knot on the string indicated a place value.
Yeah.
And these colors actually represented categories like census data, agriculture, military logistics, and the whole layout. It's very they have these chords which are very significant based on the geographic zones, the timelines, or specific officials. It's a completely symbolic and a fully structured data model.
Yeah, like a decentralized data system. So they built it 500 years ago. Maybe more than that. Before we actually got to there.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
13th century, so it's
Absolutely.
long ago. But here's
I
the
would
really
joke to crack is just coming to me. It's a geeky one, like database that could be worn and walked and remembered.
Wearing your Excel. You know?
Yeah, probably. Imagine it's like it's your accessory or it's your entire clothing, but it's not even written. So it's more and more like I would think I'm like, what? Like, how would you do this? Because there's no writing. For others, we saw writings, but here it's just the knot system.
Yeah. So, to your question on how do they do this, I should have actually picked up more references. I did have them, but I'm not able to find them over here. There were these, every region and empire had its own Kipu Kipu Kamayokos. I'm not pronouncing it right, but it could be read as someone who is an accountant or a data scientist, right? Which is a trained specialist who actually created and interpreted these Kipus. This person has the entire knowledge of what is on this Kipu, and that person alone carries that knowledge. You can't pass this information.
But then that will get lost, and that's what happened.
And
Because
that,
it was such a sophisticated system, I believe, and it's only imagine if you were the ruler of the Incans, how
yeah,
do you rule over 10 million people without any like written language? There's no centralized server, nothing. And
yeah,
like you said, this knowledge will get lost.
yeah.
So, anyhow, yeah, it's just fascinating.
No, it's very interesting that how they have preserved these for so many years, and they just were following it. And see, 10 million people, they actually ruled over 10 million people, and they were having these carried over for like generations. But yeah, just moving on, these trained specialists, like they used to gather this data locally, and then they used to relay this to Cusco, which is the empire's capital, and
Yeah.
where it was actually used to inform state level decisions.
Yeah.
That's, it sounds familiar.
You had runners essentially. You
Yes.
would send out people, they would gather information, maybe not it or whatever they'll use, come back, and then those small pockets of information will be used to feed a greater decision. So you're still drawing a decision tree, but it's all oral or
Manual. Yeah, manual and done through. So the ones you said who used to run and give the information, they are called as chaskis, basically fleet-footed messengers that used to run along the empire. It was a 40,000-kilometer road system, and they used to just do this. That was their like day to day. They used to run. They used to only take stops at tambos or like some rest stations. They used to pass along these messages and quipus, and this way they created this whole efficient system of human powered network of signal transmission.
what about the information or data being lost in translation? Imagine if you are
Yeah,
the runner, right? But you are running and assembling that information. But eventually, like you said, the
yeah.
what was the word you used for the person who's like the specialist?
Chaskis.
The
Chaskis. CHASQUIS.
oh, okay. So if they're doing the oral message relay,
Yeah.
but let's say it's because it's 40,000 kilometers. So think of it like that information is getting broken down and passed away. But do you think they check for biases or any sort of alterations? Or it's just I'm thinking from that perspective where I'm like, you're building an entire data system, but you have to check for accuracy, for biases,
Yeah.
for things getting lost in translation.
That's how it was, right? I guess it was built on trust. And how do you actually, what we have a data governance today, like we are all sharing our personal information, right? And we are actually looking at how our PII data is stored and how it is being used, but we're just trusting everything on the cloud that there is. So
It's
same
not
way they had to trust.
trusted though. There are strict GDPR compliances as well. Europe is better than US for sure, but
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And if I just have to quickly give a modern day compare, oh, actually, I have something interesting to share as well. So if you just see, for this is for like our viewers and listeners, the different kind of knots that there were. I didn't get the translation of these things, but everything was denoting a specific geography or any specific region or a whole system altogether. And it's very fascinating and interesting.
yeah, okay. They probably that's why it won't get lost in context because every knot
Yeah,
or every is it a knot or should we call it the top of the thread?
not. can call it a knot.
Does they not? So every knot has a different design, and it is
Yeah,
it's designated for maybe a centralized insight. So it's like federated intelligence that you're. It's just so many things come to me.
that's the brilliance of Inca. And I guess that's really the wrap on like this whole Inca civilization. But just to wrap it up with the whole comparison as to what Kipu is as in modern day technology, like these are actually structured data sets, right? When you look at data encoding, like how I mentioned, each not represented a number or it could be a unit, color, any of those things. It is actually a CSV file or a spreadsheet where you have rows, you have columns, you have types, you have the entire entities. And in the same way, like the hierarchy, right? We are using AI systems with federated learning. You have more like AI models that are trained on local nodes. And then there's also multimodal inputs, right? Everything that was actually derived and extracted in these quipus is what is being built in modern day tech and AI. Very interesting, like this whole federated learning concept was for me.
Yeah, no, I think I already had my share of questions because my mind directly jumped into sure, it's a sophisticated system, but because it's not documented and you're not allowed to pass on the information,
Yeah,
how do you sustain it? Then there could be so many glitches, things getting lost in translation. Like I said, you can't train it, you cannot fine tune it. There is no way to all. Maybe there's a way to analyze it. I don't know, but again, accuracy biases. Like we don't know what they were doing at the time. Yeah, maybe that was the downfall of the Incans.
probably. Yeah. But the way they built it is just truly fascinating. And I guess this is all I had for the Incans and the Nazcan civilization. I think we should start.
With the Romans. Absolutely. So I will now jump into the Roman side of the house. We'll take you obviously after we covered this, but then Romans come into 532 CE, and Constantinople was the flourishing kingdom at the time. We'll talk about Empress Theodora here because there was a fight, I think, that broke between two rival chariot teams, the Blues and the Greens, and fires raged, people died, and the emperor then, I think his name was Justinian.
Justinian, yeah.
Yeah, he was ready to run for his life. But our empress was the woman with the mind and with the might. So she was not ready to give up. She was super brave, but I think her bravery was backed by information or with science because I think behind the scenes, she was trying to create a human powered system that worked like a very early version of AI. Today, historians recognize this as a very sophisticated information processing system.
Yeah.
And what she did was, we'll get into it because there are lots of different conclusions to it. At the heart of this particular network she'd created was called as gynecium. So it was an imperial women's quarters, but in reality, it was like a dedicated information processing system. She assembled a team of women from diverse backgrounds. There were actresses who could read social cues. They were multilingual quotations with connections across social classes, mathematicians who
Hmm.
could identify patterns in all these random events. And what she trained all of these women to observe people, spot pattern, and make sense of chaos. That's what
Wow.
our intelligence units also do. So look at like how that is. I'm not saying they were like, I don't know if I'll categorize them as spies or not, but it was a sophisticated human intelligence processing system.
I love that it wasn't just brilliant, but it was women led brilliance, right? Like you had women decoding social signals, like how you mentioned, and
Yeah.
officially working as intelligence agents, right? They were not just there to, we know from prehistory and ancient times, like women were actually used for show, but these women are actually decoding maybe politicians today. And
Yeah.
we should just take a moment to recognize that this is some serious historical girl boss energy.
Yes. Also, as an empress, I think ruler's destiny and ruler's job is not that easy. And you're right, in ancient times, I don't think women were given their due. Even if you're the empress or you're the queen, or you're the princess. Women were just merely commodities, and to expand your empire, you get them married off or you marry them. It was essentially that. Sure, like they were trained in Warcraft and they had to know basic life skills and maybe how to defend their people and the country or the kingdom. But I think what she did is very interesting. And to your point, why just be beautiful objects, just be actresses or just play the part in the court, do something meaningful with it.
Wow. I
Um,
love it.
yes. So, like I said, these women, because they came from different backgrounds and they could observe people, spot the patterns, and then make sense of chaos. And how they did was, if you look at for viewers, maybe not for listeners, but you look at there are four things stated here: the
Mm.
eyes, the birds, and the weavers. There were also sorters. I don't think I was able to get the sorter image. But spies are called as the eyes, like literal eyes. So they watch the crowd, they reported on mood, colors worn, if there are strange market behaviors. Their reports went to sorters in like local bathhouses who organize this data. And then there were little kids, they were named as little birds. They ran secret messages to the palace. And at the center were these weavers. So they are like, think of them like expert analysts who wove all the information into a giant thread based map called as social tapestry. So from Mayans to Romans, we can't get rid of knots, we can't get rid of threads, but it's like a tapestry, right? Like you're building that out. With this system, Theodora learned that riots weren't random, they were being planned by powerful senators. And then she acted fast, she spread the right rumors, turned the rioters against each other, and then sent her general to strike at just the right moment. So when you look at it's an intelligent processing system, sure, but it's an insight system.
Yeah.
Warfare or wars, I would say, you can't just win them with sheer power or the amount of artillery you have or weapons. It's essentially it's mind game, right?
Yeah.
It's mind chess. You have to be very strategic in your thinking. And I know we've both studied here, we've taken game theory, stats, economics, negotiations
Hmm.
as bunch of classes. That goes into the real warfare. So I think warfare, like I said, the human part of it or the machinery, artillery part of it is one thing, but it is far more strategic. And the rebellion ended and the emperor stayed. So I think this is, and I'll give you a comparison to
Hmm.
something for the modern day, like how can we do that? There is Graphica. It's an AI
Yeah.
company. They track social media conversations. They uncover hidden influence campaigns. That's what Theodora was also doing, but just with people instead of code. And you're just mixing data, human insight. You're taking fast action because also that bias for action is very important. And I think 1400 years later, we are still trying to catch up. That was the human neural network.
Wow. So while Justinian, her husband, who was ready to pack his bags, like Theodora was like, "Hey, relax. You know what? I've got data, right?" Like she had this
Yeah.
whole system planned out. Like you mentioned, it eyes, I guess, for like sentiment analysis, and then there were sorters that were tagging the chaos, and
Yep.
weavers building the dashboard. It was literally like, boom, big data. That's what you have.
Yeah, and even till today, like I said, we every country has their own intelligence wing. That's what
Yeah.
they're doing. That's how you're making strategic war decisions. Or gathering like intel on whatever is not common, right? Like she said, she tagged, she wanted to find out what these random events are, what's happening. Are these things planned? There's so much that goes into
Yeah.
the back.
Absolutely. Somebody just please give her a woman CTO title if she didn't already have one. But very, very inspiring.
Yes. And with that, we will get into our last Roman story. That is also very interesting for me. All right. So let me start with sharing the image before I get into both Rome and Greece are of utmost importance when we talk about ancient history. And
Yeah.
then now we skip to 118 CE, where we are talking about the Aquaria vitals, so a water network. Think of Rome's own analog AI infrastructure. You touched upon it with
Glacier. Oh, you're going to the smart irrigation system, which
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Similar to it, I think these aqueducts, they were marvels of engineering, and obviously they're not there anymore. It's an extremely sophisticated system. So it's called as Aquaria Vital, which is
yeah.
like hydraulic. I think she was a hydraulic strategist, and she led the Colosseum Aquarium, a
Wow.
guild of female water scientists. We always attribute engineering and marvels to men because that's what is most documented. But I think upon a lot of excavation, they found that women engineers had a big role to play in like building these smart ducts, aqueducts.
Yeah.
So her solution wasn't, I think, just stone. What she said was she deployed gustatore, which is women with exceptional senses of taste and smell, trained to detect the mineral shifts, bacterial presence, flow changes. Then they stationed across these aqueduct systems and they submitted these daily assignments on wax tablets. And they used calculus then. It was symbolic calculus, but they still use calculus. And they captured these gradients and change over time. So then data flowed to the Scola Aquarium, where I think they used to call this calculatrix, but it's calculations. They used bronze analog devices. So if you see this, the
Yeah.
bronze devices, and the team adjusted these modules and the valves and everything that they could, and then they could redirect the flow dynamically. So think of it again like a very smart water flow system, but at the same time, you're also looking at if it's fit for you or not, if there's more bacteria. And so this worked like a distributed sensing network. And it was
Mhm.
also very adaptive because there is no electricity, no software. It's
Yeah.
running on human cognition. And so there's system design, human cognition that you can talk about. And that's what these scientists were doing. Now, if you want to think of it like in today's day and age, there's IBM, they have their water management platform. We're doing predictive analytics. You mentioned about IoT sensors.
Yeah.
So that's detecting the flow and anomalies. Siemens, like so many companies are doing it. But I think the foundation of our smart tech wasn't tool, it's thinking. And because there is human in loop, right? We're not missing that part. So then there is a lot of response and adaptation in learning. So yeah, this was just a short thing I wanted to do a call out for female engineers, which aren't very well documented. I think we give accolades to just people historians have covered or men, but I think women had a really big role for Rome to be Rome.
And so interesting, right? Both Theodora and Aquaria. Like Aquaria, she built this whole distributed
Yeah.
women-led computational system using human sensors, which is so unique. And I think you can call it biosensory AI, but more Roman edition, right?
Yes.
Very fascinating. And I think more than fascinating, it's very inspiring how both of them in from the same empire or from the same civilization, they used women actually. They employed women in that way, and they used their skill sets to actually make better decisions using data in their own way.
Yeah, yeah. So kudos to that. And with that, we wrap up episode 3. We covered these 3 fascinating civilizations. Sharing common knots and threads is what we also explored in the process. But that's a wrap. And then for the next episode, we'll go into Renaissance and Europe awakens after Dark Ages and Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so we'll get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. If I have to just have some closing thoughts, right, for this episode, it would be that if there's one thing that this episode showed us, it's that computation didn't actually start with code, right? It started with people,
Yes.
with women tasting water, mapping stars, or just reading notes or chords and like watching skies. And these were all actually living algorithms which were processing, predicting, and actually adapting. And maybe that's the smartest thing that we can do with AI today. Like, it's, let us always remember that it's humans who did it first, and that's when and that's later, that's when AI came in.
Yes, and I don't think there could be any artificial intelligence
Yeah.
without real human intelligence. So, human in loop will always be there. Yes, I think the way we look at things, we consume, we analyze, that may change. We have so many more tools at our disposal. But to your point, it all starts with us, with
Yeah.
real human intelligence. And with that, please share, subscribe to our episode. Let us know what your thoughts are. We would love comments, we would love feedback.
Yes. Thank you so much for tuning in. And that is signing off from our episode 3 for Technically Not Speaking. I'm Chaitanya Bhati, and
I'm Prachi Jain. Thank
see you
you.
in the next.
See you.